Um, I wrote things down because we had many stories shared in our family, but I thought there should be some chronology to it all. So I've just written a few things down. It seems strange to hear this property referred to as the Dodge Lodge because we grew up knowing it as Naoshi. It was built by a wonderful woman, Helen S. Ford, who had such love for this piece of land. While visiting friends in McGregor Bay, she decided to purchase property on the Manitoulin, and her search led her to Maple Point. Mr. Turner of Little Current referred her to my grandfather, Ed Drolette, to oversee the completion of building the lodge and outbuildings. I don't think he was here right at the very beginning of construction. My grandfather was a master carpenter, had worked for a logging company, and could make or fix anything, and was a very honorable man. Mrs. Ford visited my grandmother at her home in Little Current and asked her if she too would come to work for her. She told my grandmother later that she knew immediately upon walking into her sparkling clean home with the good smell of freshly baked bread that she was the person she wanted to work for her. She welcomed the entire family. My Aunt Edith, who would have been about 18 at the time, became a server and helped my grandmother clean. My uncle, Dick Drolette, and a cousin, Frank Drolette, also worked here. My Aunt Laura was married to Joe Lowe of Killarney, and they would come by boat to visit and often bring whitefish to be served to Mrs. Ford and her guests. My mother was still going to school, but she was here on weekends and during the summer. It was a very exciting time when Mrs. Ford arrived at Maple Point, driven by her chauffeur, accompanied by her friend, Miss Allen, who stayed the entire season. And they always had another car laden with supplies. She would bring her sewing machine and much fabric. Even though she was a very wealthy woman, she liked to sew. And she made many of the curtains, cushions, and bedspreads for all of the rooms in the lodge. In fact, in 1970, I brought my mother here to see the place, and it was being looked after by a caretaker, and the original things that Mrs. Ford had made for her quarters were still there, very faded and very tattered. I'm not sure of Mrs. Ford's age. My mother was very young, and she said she was an elderly lady when she owned Naoshi. But her family felt she was in the wilderness and did not have the same fondness for this place as she did. They worried about her being so far away, and they urged her to sell this place. And eventually, she did sell it to the Dodge family. I understand that Danny's name is on the deed, but his mother seemed to be in control of this estate. Working conditions changed for my grandparents. My grandparents really liked Danny Dodge, and they did say they felt sorry for him because his mother was so domineering. He was a very likable, pleasant young man, and they also really liked the woman that he chose for his wife. He liked to hang out with the men. He was the only one who called my grandmother Mrs. Drolette once they took over, and one day he asked her if he could please eat with the guys, because they lived in the building that we had dinner served from. He always raved about her cooking and would thank her after every meal. When the Dodge family bought Maple Point and my grandfather was informing them about the property, he explained that unused dynamite used in construction was buried for safety, and it was never to be touched. Danny seemed to have a fascination about it, and several times he questioned my grandfather about the dynamite. My grandfather, who had a very short fuse, would get cross, and my mother remembers him saying, "If that fool touches it, he could blow us all to kingdom come." And I'm sure that was sprinkled with a few curse words that he was going to use. My grandparents were not happy working for Mrs. Dodge. They knew they could not go on working here, even though they loved the place. because the atmosphere was very different from when Mrs. Ford owned the place. When Danny married Laureen, my mother said she wanted some of her friends to work here. I don't really know if my grandparents quit or were let go. I found out today that they were let go. When news of the tragedy hit Little Current, my uncle and cousins were all in boats helping in the search for Danny Dodge. My grandparents felt terrible because they had always liked him.
Thank you so much for that. My grandmother was a really nutty until she got older, and then she seemed to mellow a little.
Oh, that seems to happen with some people.
Isn't that amazing? But so I can just only imagine. I mean, she had supply closets and requisition orders in a private home. This had nothing to do with your grandparents and parents. That's how she was. You know, everything was. She didn't trust anybody. But you know, she was responsible for a huge part of the Dodge factory. So this was part of her mindset. It had nothing to do with trusting your family whatsoever. But thanks for the insights on my uncle, because we never heard stories about him. We weren't allowed to talk about him.
First of all, before I start, I'd like to commend the present and past owners of this lodge for bringing it back to its state that it was 25 to 50 years ago. You not only should be commended, but you have the gratitude of the community for doing this.
Welcome.
It's good to see you. All right, my name is Ozzie Hunt, and I guess I'm one of the few people about that actually knew Daniel Dodge and his family. Daniel was a few years older than I am, but he was a youth, and so were we at that time. And so consequently, I guess I first met him when he came into our businesses in Kagwan to send telegrams. We had a telephone operator which we sent telegraphs to the CPR in Little Current and sent them on. And we also had a gas station where he got gases for his vehicles and boat and so forth. And said that, but basically Danny's time that I would have spent with him would have been a youth at the dock and other places. Youth gathered at the dock to swim just like they are today and were doing last week and so forth. And we ran up and down the dock pushing one another in and this type of thing. And Daniel fit very well into that picture. He was a youth and very much, as you described him in your document, Terry, what your family said. He was a likable chap, and he was friendly, and got along with everyone that I knew. He had a beautiful convertible that traced all of this, and of course we all tried to get him to take us to Gorby or someplace back in his red convertible and so forth. And he had this fabulous speedboat along with other things. So being youth, we went and traced with Daniel, and of course to us he was called Danny. That's what he was commonly known to the boys in the dock. However, I did know his family slightly by coming out here to deliver things at the odd occasion. I know both the Drulettes and the Valaquits that we took on later in the operation of this place, and it was quite an impressive resort in that time. It was outstanding in our community, and it's been brought back very close to that today. So that's what I wanted to mention. That's my commentary.
Thank you.
I'm the son of Frank Valiquette, Sr., and I spent my youth picking weeds here. I am an expert weed picker. I have several years of experience at it. But however, I did grow up here some 18 to 20 years that my dad was here, and I spent most of my summers here, and my Easter vacation was here. So anytime my dad could get me out here, I guess he wanted company, which is understandable. More than once he would happen to be passing the field over there, and some of those deer pictures you see. Would haul me out of school to come out and haul the deer out of the bush and process it. Anyhow, I was here, I don't know which year it would have been that my dad left. He, when it was sold by the Dodge people, I recall this, that Mrs. Dodge gave my dad a commission of the retail amount that she sold it for. She gave my dad that amount, and which year I don't recall, but anyhow, the new owner then were Colonel and Mrs. Morrow. They were Canadians from St. Catharines, Ontario. And my dad continued on working for them for a period of perhaps 4 to 5 years. And then he quit. And he got a job with the Ontario government and Ministry of Transportation and did very well. He got up to be a general foreman with the government. So other than my sister and all of the whole family, there were 6 of us kids who grew up here. My sister's over there. I have our family is still alive. My dad passed on very early in life. He ended up getting rheumatic fever and had a very weak heart from there on. So he passed away at age 48, which was very early in life. And I don't have any more to contribute. If anybody wants to ask questions, I would be more than happy to.
I was curious whether your father spoke about the accident.
No.
Is that something?
I recall that my dad had the lighter that lit the fuse. It was a gold lighter, and I still remember how it worked. You would flick up the top, it would take the top off, then you would twist the wheel, and of course it would light. And when you wanted it to go out, you pulled the top back down. And it was around the house for years after. And where it disappeared to, I don't have any idea. But apparently that's the one that lit the fuse.
Did he share his thoughts with your mother?
I don't recall that.
No way. Yeah, but the event was not something that was spoken.
No. I don't ever recall it being a debated subject in the house.
Okay, what story do you want?
Introduce yourself.
My name is Dave Herco,
And I'm Sandy Herc.
and I guess we should start at the beginning. So you can explain that story.
We bought the lodge in 1998, much to the chagrin of my father, who took my husband aside and said, "What have you gotten my daughter into?" And basically we sold everything that we owned in Alberta and moved out here with no jobs and decided we were going to renovate this building and bring it back to life. So
Yeah, we knew no history of the building at the time when we purchased it. I knew a Dodge only from the truck I was driving. I had no clue that the Dodge family owned this place or any of the history about it or anything like that. So we spent 8 years here, discovered that history during the time in which we renovated this building. Now, when we originally bought this building, it was in deplorable condition. It had remained pretty much vacant for about 20 years.
30.
It had been owned by the Ruby family, which is along the North Shore. They owned farms, that sort of thing. There were 9 boys in the family, and they spent a couple of weeks from... I met a couple of the sons, and they'd spend a couple of weeks in the summer out here, and the rest of the time it just remained open. People would come in, that sort of thing. They did very little repair. So when we got here,
The grass was up to our chests.
Yeah,
There were animals living inside.
yeah, there were lots of animals living inside. When it rained inside just like it rained outside.
26 buckets in the living room alone for the first rainstorm.
Yeah, there was no electricity in the main lodge. They were running an extension cord from the little building.
No
Because
water.
there was hydro to the little building. There was no running water whatsoever. No septic system that I was aware of. And so we started by renovating the small servants' quarters first, because that's where we were going to live. So we spent almost an entire year renovating that. We gutted it, insulated it, put in plumbing, all that sort of thing, made it livable. And then we started on this place, and we just basically went room by room, roof shingle by roof shingle.
We actually discovered rooms as we went along,
Yeah.
because we didn't know there were bathrooms throughout. You'd open a door and it would just be crammed full of junk. And you'd take the junk out and, oh look, there's a tub. So that was great, and
Yeah.
discoveries.
Yeah, so as we hooked up the plumbing and all hot water and that sort of thing, I remember hooking up the plumbing, we had to dig a shore well, so the entire front yard was torn up. And it was about that time when we were doing those renovations that we got a hold of people who had lived here before, or people who had worked here before, or their relatives, and we got photographs, and we ended up getting the original blueprints for the place, and photographs. And so our goal was to, if we were going to put a piece back onto the building, that we were gonna try and replicate what it was in 1920. As an example, he was talking about the road, the turnaround here. When we bought this place, that did not exist. The turnaround was gone, it was all overgrown, there was no road there. So when we put it in, actually I cleared that area out and I found one side of where the rocks were that he was talking about, that line, the walkways, and I could see where it originally was. So when we built the road, we tried to duplicate it exactly where it was before based on what we could find in the ground, that sort of thing. So that's the approach we took to the building. And in doing all those renovations and painting it the same colors, green and red, that sort of thing.
We also ran it as a bed and breakfast.
Yeah, and that paid for the renovations. And I remember clearly after about 2 or 3 years of renovating and putting our furniture in the living room and putting it together what we thought it was originally, from the pictures and all that sort of thing. I remember Oz came up here for a party, and he walked in and he goes, "It's exactly the way I remember it." And so I knew right there that
We were on the right track.
we were on the right track. That he said even the furniture's in the same place, right? So obviously we kind of figured that out. So that was 10,000 man hours we spent in renovations, and it still looks like an old building. But you got to remember there was no running water. So like when I hooked up the water as an example, and I pressurized that big tank in there and turned on the water, there was not a sink or a toilet
or a tub.
that just didn't spew water everywhere. I could hear it gushing like a waterfall all the way down to the end. And so basically I had to start from one room and re-plumb every single, and there's a sink in every room, and there's 4 bathrooms, and so we had to re-plumb everything all the way along until it was finally sealed, and that was just a month's worth of work right there, just doing that, let alone painting the entire outside. It took me an entire summer.
And 5 years to roof it.
5 years to re-roof it. I took 25 tons of shingles off this roof. It was 4 deep, and I put 12 tons back on. And that took 5 years of friends that I no longer have.
Sal?
Well, except for Sal. Sal's here. But yeah, that was, and we fell in love with the project, with the history of it,
The process.
the process of it, and we put in the fences, we put in the grass, we put in the plants, we put the rocks around the trees. Wherever we found an old rock garden, we tried to restore that. Yeah, so we tried to get it as close as possible to what we thought it was originally, without taking anything away from it. So, and I had a lot of fun bringing that history. I mean, I don't know anything about Danny Dodge's, I know about his history, but I wasn't around when Oz was around. I'm not related to those people or that story. But being able to preserve something that other people find intrinsically valuable to that history is,
An honor.
I'm pretty proud of doing that. Because it's obviously important to some people, and I just did it for the love of the building and the love of the property, and it was a hell of a great project, and we sold it to a great family, and they're more Dodge fanatics than I ever was, so I know it's in good hands, and they'll take really good care of it,
As they have.
as they have.
Oh, and to finish it off, by the time we put it up for sale and we had a buyer, my father thought we were insane for selling it. So we came full circle.
Full circle.
I think I'll pull these pictures out after. My name is Linda Hunter. My mother was Doris Riching from Gore Bay, and she was a very good friend of Lorene's. Actually, I think Lorene had a lot of good friends in Gore Bay growing up. I'm going to mention a few of them because they were all involved in her life before she met Dan, and certainly were the pieces that filled in some of the puzzle after. There was Pauline Smith, who was the only one surviving, Henrietta Kinney, Marion Toots Johnson, and my mother. And I think I've missed somebody, but anyway, and she had another group of friends that were outside that immediate circle. I have a story I was going to tell at dinner, but we weren't quite close enough at dinner to tell it. But as I was growing up, Toots, and Aunt Marion was my godmother, and we'd dine there a lot. It was back and forth because everybody at that point, at least my parents, my godparents, lived in Toronto. And I'd be sitting down to dinner, and Johnny, you may have even heard this yourself, and suddenly there would be this sort of little shout from Marion, "Dig in, Dan." Do you remember her saying that? So that went on for years, and I really just thought it was some kind of saying. And finally, when I was 10 or 12, I said, "For heaven's sakes, what on earth does that mean?" And they explained to me it went back to Danny Dodge. And I said, okay, because I was just getting the pieces. This stuff wasn't talked about when I was younger. And so they explained to me that one night, Mrs. Johnson, Marion's mother, had Dan in for dinner. Apparently everybody took care of Dan. It's amazing he had any help here, because when he was in Gore Bay, he was in demand. Everybody wanted to have him for dinner, over for a visit. He was such an affable young man. So anyway, Mrs. Johnson served dinner one night, and coming from an elitist family doing all the proper things, Dan was sitting there with his hands folded waiting for everybody else to start dinner. Well, that's not how it was done in Gore Bay in the day. You put the food on the table and everybody started serving themselves, right? So Mrs. Johnson finally said to Dan, "For heaven's sakes, Dan, dig in!" And from then on, around that circle of friends, it was dig in, Dan. You might have even heard it when you were little if you're around Tobacco Lake, not knowing at the time what it meant, but that's where it came from. So that's my fun story. My mother was very close to Lorene. After she died, after Dan died, she became Lorene's companion for at least a year, maybe two. I'm not sure exactly on the dates. Lorene seemed to want to get away from Detroit and Toronto because there was a lot of press, and in those days I guess she was the woman of the hour, so they spent a fair amount of time in Florida. My mother knew a lot more about what was going on here than I'll ever know, but they also attended Alma College in St. Thomas together, and took some courses and some finishing school stuff. And my mother remained her companion for some time, and then moved on with her own career as a teacher, and eventually they both got married. But my mother and we stayed in touch, and we visited in Indiana. I think my mother visited before I remember, but then we were there again when we were before. But the big thing I remember is everybody talked about how wonderful Dan was, that he was a really nice person.
My name's Jim Bartlett. I'm Danny Dodge's grand-nephew. In learning about this, which came fairly late for me, because as my mother pointed out, my family really didn't talk about this. More and more details got filled in. In my early adulthood and adult life, I've had a lot of experience on various battlefields around the world, and I have a certain experience with combat medicine. The accident that has been described and the conditions under which it occurred and the munition that was present that caused it, I am convinced that he was suffering from a traumatic brain injury, and in addition to everything else, from the blast effect of dynamite going off in your hands, basically. And now that you just said that there was a skull fracture involved, that makes it even more sure to me. There's been controversy about why Dan would get up and fall out of the boat. people with severe head injuries suffer brain trauma, and they may seem very lucid, but they're not. And there's hitches that occur. You're not always thinking logically. For example, I have to drive the boat, but didn't think it through. A, I'm injured. B, rough water. C, if I stand up, I'm probably going to fall out of the boat. We as normal people walking around, that would be our thought process. When you've suffered a traumatic brain injury, it doesn't work like that. You just say, I need to drive the boat, and you stand up, and the next thing you know, you're overboard. We've seen this over and over again in Iraq, and it's only very recently that we're coming to understand the full spectrum of these sorts of traumatic brain injuries that are caused by the blast effect of an explosion. And that's because we have brain scanning technology now that allows you to look in and see what exactly has happened. And all this makes perfect sense. It's just you get your bell rung really, really badly, and you're not thinking right, and small mistakes snowball into big catastrophes. And that's just the way it works.
You know, I just think it was a combination of bad weather and
Bad
disorientation, bad luck, the injuries, perfect storm.
Yep.
Basically, our story started probably about 3 years back, perhaps 4 years back. Sandy and Dave, through a local individual, had an article done in what's called Cottage Life magazine. And they had done some various shots of the grounds and the inside, and wrote an article of the fact that it was a bit of Dodge history in here, and that these folks had basically reconstructed a lot of this. And I read this article looking at it thinking, boy, those lucky people, they got a beautiful spot there with a bit of Dodge history. And Dave was mentioning at the time that they're ready to move on. They've done what they were here to do, and that they were selling the property. So for the next year and a half or so, we were back and forth trying to negotiate what would work for us. Needless to say, at the end of the day, we got it. The kids, fortunately, were as committed to this place as I was, and as Cindy is. And quite frankly, the undertaking we have here takes a family effort. And we all have our strong points. And I think from what everybody can see here, we're trying to maintain it as best as we can as it was back 70, 80 years ago. And the biggest challenge we've had is to get enough photographic material to see how it looked at the time, what the grounds looked like at the time, so that we can slowly bring things back as it was laid out back in the 1930s. And it's slowly coming together, and we're getting a bit of assistance from various establishments. I think within the next year or so we should have most of our photographs in line, so we have our work cut out for next year again. And kids will get a little bit of a holiday and a lot of working in it. But part of this whole event today was sort of something I had planned, Rick had planned. We thought it was very important that the community be aware of what took place here many years ago. And it was very important for the Dodge and McDonald family to fill in the puzzle of their past with all the missing pieces. And for myself, and I'm sure I speak for Rick, I'm hoping that we have accomplished that for all of you folks today. I would also like to state